Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to the Data Accessibility and Privacy Workshop as part of the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force. My name is Teodora Kaneva, and I'm the chair of this group. I'm also leading on TechUK's infrastructure stream, and in particular, our energy utilities transport work. I also wanted to introduce today Randolph Brazier, who is the Director of Innovation and Electricity Systems at the Energy Networks Association and the sponsor of this group. So our goal for today is to present our work in progress and test some of our assumptions with the audience. Initially, we will take you through the format of today's workshop and provide an overview of the task force in general. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with EVET, to be able to understand the scope. Each of our speakers today will have 15 minutes to present our findings. We will prepare some polls in the meantime for your consideration as well. And we will allow 40 minutes per session for a moderated Q&A and the discussion. The workshop is being recorded, as you can already see, and it will be published later on the EVET website. I would like to kindly ask the participants to remain on mute while our speakers are presenting. And shall we have any questions? Please do submit any questions in the Q&A box. For any comments or feedback, we have also opened the chat function as well. For any feedback from the polls, please use the chat function also. And we will provide an opportunity for the audience to submit any further details or case studies for our consideration by 14th May, which is next Friday. We will publish more information on how to do that a little bit later or as a follow-up to the workshop. But first, I just want to give you a little bit of information on the Electric Vehicle Energy Task Force, or as we will refer to it as EVET or the Task Force later on, just for short. So the task force is chaired by Energy Systems Catapult Chief Executive Philip New, and is part of the Road to Zero strategy announced by government in anticipation of growth in the use of electric and plug-in vehicles over the next couple of years. The objective really is to put the EV user at the heart of preparing the electricity system for the mass take-up of electric vehicles. And it aims to ensure that costs and emissions are as low as possible and opportunities for vehicles to provide grid services are capitalized on. For any benefit of the system, the energy bill payers or the electric vehicle owners. At the end of phase one, the task force made 21 proposals in January last year. Those proposals were to ensure that the energy system is able to accelerate the mass take-up of EVs. At the invitation of government, EVET moves to its second phase of activities to ensure these proposals are put into action. And now we're providing a collaborative and strategic review to prepare some actions and monitor each proposal and communicate progress on their implementation. The second phase has been transformed into 4 working groups, transport and planning, to help define the responsibility, guidance, and resources that exist and are needed to support public and private organizations in the delivery, operation, and maintenance of public EV charging infrastructure. Consumer engagement, which focuses on the consumer journey, gaps in consumer understanding about EVs, consumer charging behavior, and how we can ensure that consumers are armed with the right information. Smart charging and cybersecurity, to identify the scope and body that will be responsible for the implementation of cybersecurity practices. And of course, our group data accessibility and privacy. So our group considers issues pertaining to utilizing and protecting data for better consumer outcomes and policy decisions. So as part of our work, we will be mapping any existing data share work in the industry and government and create a gap analysis for outstanding data infrastructure outputs. And we will create recommendations for government and industry. As part of our work, we have 3 particular recommendations that we have taken aboard. So we are looking into recommendations 11, 12, and 13 from the first phase of EVET. So as part of recommendation 11, we're looking at system optimization through shared intelligence, where we will be looking at the system, digital integration, and analyzing the value of data sharing agreements, infrastructure delivery, and what are the market and regulatory mechanisms to achieve that optimization. Then we're taking this work further and looking into the data exchange necessary to make public EV charge points simple to use. The way we're doing this is to map the data needs, creating end user use cases and addressing the availability of data. As part of that exercise, we're also reviewing current standards in place. Last but not least, we are creating a risk analysis as part of recommendation 13, where EVET 1 has proposed that Ofgem and government should introduce data access and privacy framework for the sector to ensure that consumers have the full control over their data. And essentially, that means that the consumers should be made aware of all of the data access issues at the point of sale throughout their consumer journeys. At Gemserv, and he will be presenting our first part of the work, which is achieving system optimization through shared intelligence. Thank you and enjoy the workshop.
Thank you, Theo. Thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here and good afternoon. So I'm going to walk you through the work that we do with recommendation 11. Recommendation 11 is essentially focusing on the upstream value that we can create through optimization of EV charging, in particular in terms of sharing intelligence and sharing data between the different stakeholders. What does it mean from an electric systems point of view? We can quantify the opportunity by looking at the total number of vehicle miles that we travel in the UK and converting those into the demand for low carbon electricity. And if you do this, the government has brought forward the stop of sales for fossil fuel vehicles to 2030. And essentially, if we start phasing out electric vehicles and the whole vehicle park in the UK is electric, then that would equate to something in the order of 82 terawatt hours of electricity per year in terms of demand. So I think this is just to sort of give a little bit of background why electric vehicles and integration and the optimization of the electricity system is actually quite important to look at this in quite some detail. Now, this demand actually is not like any other demand, like your oven, your fridge freezer and toaster and kettle. I think what is different here is that electric vehicle charging comes with a charging infrastructure. We are talking about managed charging, and we have digital capabilities to monitor and control the EV charging. And that essentially are sort of key cornerstones in terms of being able to optimize the use of the electricity system. And I think that is really, really important because the electricity system is not just there to provide EV charging, but is providing electricity for everybody else nationwide. And also to optimize the battery storage that is embedded within the vehicle park. Why is that important? Because again, if we quantify this, once the UK has moved towards electric vehicles, we will have something in the order of 4 terawatt-hours worth of battery storage geographically distributed within the UK. So it's worthwhile being able to optimize that, not just for the electricity system, but also for the consumer. But also, I think, to further push the uptake of low-carbon electricity in the UK, which will be quite an important contribution towards the road to net zero for the UK. At the heart of all this, in order to achieve the system optimization, actually we're looking at a quite significant system integration task. And system integration task in terms of making sure that the systems of the various stakeholders who are essentially acting within the EV market can exchange information in a way that is beneficial and secure. So to actually understand this a little bit further, where the opportunities are and how we might be able to go about this, what we see here essentially are the pathways for data integration or system integration. And we can already see here that it's not sort of one single stakeholders. Actually, there are many stakeholders who can contribute towards that. And let me just talk you through sort of the top graph here. On the one side, we have the low carbon electricity system, which we want to optimize and make sure it's being used in the best possible way. Then we have another a couple of digital capabilities that reside within the different industry sectors. So in the automotive spectrum, we have the automotive services that can directly control the electric vehicles. As you know, if you drive an EV, you can use your vehicle app to check what your state of charge is, or car manufacturers are actually providing updates to vehicles in terms of new software, etc., over the air, etc., and so forth. So there is essentially an existing pathway for integration of the electric vehicles with automotive services. Then the next category, essentially, this is sort of the industry sector that is primarily tasked with the rollout of public charging infrastructure. So these are the charge point operators, the EMSP, that essentially deliver the vast majority of managed charging services in the public space. And they also have a route right down to the EV. It goes essentially through their cloud capabilities. It then connects to the charging assets, which they control via their charge point operator platforms. It's described here as EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment, or basically charging stations, which then subsequently connect to EVs. And again, we have a pathway for data exchange through the whole path here. There's also building blocks within the energy system that potentially may play a role here. So smart metering would be one of it. Smart metering essentially is a secure infrastructure that provides communications to a lot of smart meters. Smart meters here are essentially represented as ESME or SAPC. SAPC essentially standing for standalone load controllers. They then in turn will integrate with the charging station, and then you have from the charging station the route to the EV. And then you have a whole range of other cell providers in the market that may contribute as well. So you have, for example, the navigation systems that may, map out not just your travel itinerary and the road that you may use and optimize those in terms of, the shortest, the fastest, most economic one, but also actually where the charging points are on your route, as well as potentially being able to reroute the journey if, for example, there's an event that may say, actually, if you want to charge your car on the way, it's a different set of charging points. It might be more applicable, and so forth. And then you have other sectors like the tech companies, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Amazons of this world, who provide potentially in the future a lot of cloud services that may have an impact here. So to what end do we want to actually have all this integration and data integration between all the different actors? And I think just to clarify that all these boxes represent multiple companies in the different sectors and multiple products and services. There is no monopoly here. That essentially is a collection of actors with products and services who need to collaborate and work together in order to maximize best possible outcome. From an electricity systems point of view, there are quite a number of use cases that will benefit from that capability, but I've essentially categorized them into 3 parts. One essentially is we have a overload constraint that we need to mitigate somewhere within the electricity system. This should always be seen that it's essentially geographically bound to a particular area. And the opportunity that we have here, because we have digital capability to monitor and essentially control the EV charging through the pathways that you see on top of the slide here, that we can ramp down the charging demand fairly quickly. So it essentially is a digital command that reconfigures something either in the charging station or the electric vehicle, and you can very, very quickly deliver a drop in the charging demand for a given period of time. The second opportunity is sort of the other way around, that actually everything is fine in the electricity system, and the wind turbines at the coast of England are churning away because we have extremely good weather conditions, but actually the demand isn't there. And I think this is also problematic because fundamentally what it means is you have to curtail, for example, generation, which then results into loss of revenue, and then actually you can't capture this energy when you actually need it, and when the wind turbine and the weather conditions may not be that suitable. So in the same way as we can ramp down the demand for EV charging in specific geographic areas, we can also use that capability to ramp up EV charging. And to sort of just describe this a little bit in more detail, electric vehicles can charge over a range of power settings. So it can be very minimal, or it can be suspended, or you can bring it up to either what the maximum capability is of the onboard charger if you use AC charging, or you can bring it up to the maximum of the DC chargers if you have direct access to the vehicle battery, which can be up to 150 kilowatt nowadays, or even higher. So there is a big sort of play in terms of how you can mitigate these type of events in the electricity system. And thirdly is really looking at the battery asset that is embedded within the vehicles. And that means charge and discharge the battery. There are 2 fundamental ways of looking at this. Obviously, you can discharge the battery by driving your vehicle, and what you effectively do is converting the electricity stored in the battery into miles. But that actually, in reality, is a relatively small proportion in terms of creating investment returns on the actual asset of the passive battery in the vehicle. The other opportunities that we have here essentially is that we can have bidirectional power flow, often referred to as vehicle to home, vehicle to building, or vehicle to grid, V2X essentially. And therefore you can provide electricity back to the electricity system that previously was stored in the battery. So I think there's a lot to play here with a lot to gain, because all of this is really, really large scale, and because it affects the system as a whole, it either benefits everybody, or if you don't do it right, we have to pay extra, basically. So how is this leading up in terms of what we should do? So we have quite a lot of recommendations that are quite specific to a range of use cases, but I tried to sort of summarize it as the underlying principle. So we have, in essence, a fairly large amount of electricity demand over the year, 82 terawatt hours, that we can digitally control. That's the opportunity here. It is also, I think, pretty much decided that fossil fuel vehicles will be phased out, and therefore UK PLC at some point in time will be running pretty much on electric vehicles. We also see that really, in order to optimize the system and create the benefit and the value for everybody, it is really relying on the integration of those systems to share data and market intelligence. And this is a system integration task. And this brings out the sort of old favorite action. In order to make this work, we need interoperability between all those different systems. And therefore, we need to define APIs, how those different systems can essentially communicate with each other, making sure that the different platforms from the different stakeholders actually have the capabilities in order to do that. And I think that will then allow us to leverage those capabilities for all the individual stakeholders and different industry sectors, and of course, the consumer. The compliance, I think, that we are heading for is really that there are certain data items or groups of data that are within those digital platforms that are beneficial to be shared between the different stakeholders. So if you look at it from the demand side point of view, essentially sharing the aggregate electricity demand or the forecast of this with regards to specified geographic areas over a time period is extremely useful in terms of mitigating essentially the constraints that you have within the electricity system. And that information is essentially distributed, across all those different platforms, whether this is automotive, CPU, EMSP, or anybody else, and it needs to be essentially extracted from there. And all those stakeholders essentially manage a part of the overall EV national infrastructure and therefore contributing towards that. But it also works the other way around in terms of providing data to those stakeholders and their digital platform capabilities to actually take information into account that resides within the electricity system. And that can be then actioned and optimized through those digital platforms. So for example, understanding whether there are any supply constraints in the distribution network in a particular area where a charge point operator operates, making sure that the charge point operator knows about this, making sure that the consumer actually has visibility in terms of what charge points to avoid and which other charge points essentially might step in order to mitigate this, is a typical applications how data sharing can really optimize this. Same counts for system utilization, so whether it's actually managing a overload constraint or managing essentially curtailment of generation, things like this, or in fact mitigating any emergency events that may happen. So I think that is sort of the key asset, and because it's all system-based and it's all essentially large scale, it's really important that we have that capability built in. It needs to be compliant within the different platforms of the stakeholders, and it needs to be interoperable. And then we can drive this forward in terms of the greenest and most sustainable way to optimize the electricity system and effectively make progress on the road to net zero by essentially, maximizing the uptake of decarbonized electricity. And that's it in a nutshell from me. Back to you, Theo.
Thank you so much, Joachim. I see that we already had one question inserted in the questions and answers. We have also prepared a poll questionnaire for the audience to answer, if we could put those live as well. But in the meantime, Joachim, there was a question on standards. For example, what standards should UK PLC be considering for the interoperability APIs you mentioned, if any?
Yeah, I think there are actually quite a number of standards that are emerging. So I think there is 15118, and there is Shadowmore in terms of vehicle to charging stations, which provides, the capabilities for bidirectional charging sessions. There's also CCS2 coming along that will do the same thing for the European standard. And then you have standards further up in terms of how you share the information between the charging stations and the cloud services. I think strong contenders here essentially are the Open Charge Alliance protocol, so OCPP 1.6 upwards, and also in particular the development that is going on with OCPP 2.x, which is a real step change in terms of catering for the upstream value creation. So, you know, the how you manage the energy services, the mitigation, the flexibility of that with the infrastructure. And potentially there are others that may still come along, because one thing not to forget is that the charging technologies that we have today, or that are actually making their way into the market today, are not necessarily the charging technologies that we will have in 10 years times, and therefore there may be additional standards that come along there. I think the other important thing is to make sure that it's really clear what the roles and responsibilities are of the different stakeholders who have the capability to influence the charging infrastructure, and to make sure that we utilize, you know, existing standards and technologies for secure data sharing, and make sure that the solution that we end up with essentially is resilient. I think that is really, really important, because after all, the electricity system and subsequently the charging solutions for electric vehicles are critical to the UK.
We've also had another question from Lee Griffiths. Which APIs are currently available? For example, Octopus Energy has provided the Agile API, but how will this be done through resellers, or will API provision be through wholesale generation?
I think this is still a little bit of an outstanding question. The bottom line is we will have APIs to quite a range of different systems. I think the system architecture itself is probably still a little bit fluent, and also this leads back to sort of, you know, the roles and responsibilities of the different stakeholders. But it doesn't change the underlying thing that essentially we know what type of data is useful for the optimization of the system, and that this data need to be shared in a secure and authorized way, I would say, as well. I think one thing to understand is that there are really massive benefits that we can derive from being able to work together and share data and turn this into a win-win situation for lots of different stakeholders. But it needs to be done in a way that is secure and resilient, and not essentially creates any volatilities to the system. And I think that is really, really important.
Thank you so much, Joachim. Are there any more questions? Please do refer also to the polls. We have included 3 specific questions. Do you support that CPO platforms managing large-scale EV charging networks should provide capabilities to share EV charging demand data by geographical location and support mitigating higher utilization of renewable electricity generation? With suitable consumer protection and a viable business case, do you support that data should be shared to facilitate best use of the distribution network assets for the benefit of all electricity consumers? We do have some people who have responded no to that question. So if you could expand on why do you think that might be a no for you? And the third question is, do you support that data should be shared by the vehicle and the charging infrastructure to facilitate value creation from the battery storage capacity embedded with the electric vehicle park for vehicle to building or vehicle to grid applications? There have been some answers no here as well. So please do share your thoughts on why do you think that will be a no for you? Okay, so we will move on with our next speaker. In this case, if you think of any other questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. So we are moving on to our colleague Paul Barnfather, head of electric vehicle infrastructure at EA Technology. Paul will talk about making public charge points simple and easy to use through open EV data. Paul, up to you.
Okay, thank you, Teo. All right, I assume you can see me. Welcome everyone to the next part of this afternoon's workshop. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to be presenting on behalf of a team that have worked on this particular question, which is making charge points easy to use. So hopefully you've got lots of opinions on what we should do. So the team that have contributed to this are Eleanor Teodora from the Energy Networks Association, Natasha Patel and Chloe Labar from Baringa, and James Werner from Osprey Charging, and Sophie Adams from OZEV. So it's a small team that's worked on this. Very, very keen to get your thoughts and opinions on what we've done. We're going to share with you some of the interim results of our recommendations, but we certainly don't claim to have all the answers. So very keen to hear any of your views. Right, so this bit is focusing on the data exchange at the charge point. So in that diagram there, we've got a charge point that is effectively talking to the electricity system that Joachim covered earlier. And it's also talking to the vehicle through various mechanisms, and it's getting and exchanging data with the user as well, either through a touch screen or a card, or so there's an interface there as well. But those are basically the interfaces that the charge point has. And what we're trying to do here is make the charge point simple and easy to use. It's not always the case at the moment. And we recognize that there are some data exchanges that are probably more difficult than they need to be at the moment, or the data's missing. And that's what we hope to put right. And we're trying to make use of open data wherever possible. Yes, it's possible to develop standards. Yes, it's possible to introduce legislation. These things take time. So the focus for the group has been, how can we make use of what's already there? And then we'll be making recommendations on what gaps still remain. What we recognized from the OZEV consultation, which I'm sure many of you participated in, was that there is no single use case for a charge point. You know, the charge point might look the same, but the reasons and the circumstances under which people use charge points vary enormously. And as a result, the data that's available or needed for that transaction also changes. So what we've done is taken a very much an end user use case approach, really thinking about why is this particular person needing to use this public charge point, and then looking at the data that surrounds that. So what you can see on the screen there are the use cases that we have considered. Now it's not complete. There are many, many more use cases, recognize that. But what we hope is that those use cases are at least representative for typical use cases today. Might not be right for the future, but for today, we think that these use cases are about right. And I'd very much welcome your views on these. Have we missed anything that's really crucial? In particular, have we missed a group of users who might not be significant in number, but nevertheless have very specific needs? And I'll be putting a question up later on to hopefully capture that as well. But effectively the use cases there, the classic one, I'm in a hurry, I need to charge. So a simple rapid charging circumstance. I've come from where, I'm going somewhere, it doesn't matter where, I need to charge and I want to do so as quickly as possible. So classic ultra rapid use case there. Second one down, something to eat. I'm not in a hurry. I've got an hour or so to kill. I need a break. So the circumstance of charging here is I can charge slightly slower. My criteria might not be speed of charging, it might be price, it might be location, it might be quality of food. So we've got a slightly different use case here. Third one, and the second one, of course, you've got a little bit of flexibility about where, you know, it's like choosing a restaurant, you go to the one that you want, not necessarily the nearest one. Third one, I've arrived, well, I'm at my destination, that's a fix, so the location is fixed. There's no real negotiation about where I'm going because I've arrived, but I've now got quite a lot of time at my destination. So this might be for a meeting or, you know, or a visit somewhere. So that's destination charging typically. Trip to the shops, again, I've got limited choice around my shopping trip, usually choice of maybe 2 or 3 supermarkets if I'm lucky. Duration, probably fairly fixed. You're between half an hour and a half, depends how much shopping you want to do. And again, my needs for that one, I probably haven't driven very far. Unlike some of the other ones where I might have driven hundreds of miles, I'm not going to be driving hundreds of miles to the shops. I've only done a short trip, but I still might want to charge my car up by a significant amount because I haven't got other charging options. So trip to the shops is one there. Staying the night, that's another destination type one, but in this case, I know I've got a very long time to charge, typically 12 hours. But again, location, some choice on location maybe for houses, but not necessarily. Petrol station use case, that's very much fitting into the current infrastructure, which some EV users do use, where they are stopping at a petrol station and filling up in the same way that they would as if it was petrol. So stop, fill up, move on. Then we've got some other use cases there. The van driver tends to be going from one place to another with limited time, not always a long distance. And it's an opportunistic stop for, you know, maybe a refreshment and a break. So person with a van was one of the use cases we use. Taxi driver is kind of similar, except the hours are a little different. Park and ride is another one where I know that the vehicle is going to be stationary for probably a few hours. Park and ride tends not to be used for half an hour, usually about 4 hours. And it's at a particular site where there's a bus. Interchange, similar. This is more a commuter interchange where I drive to a station and get on the train. So I'm going to be leaving my car for a significant amount of time. Typically, if you're going on a train journey somewhere, you're not going to be back within a few hours. So transport interchange is another use case. Going to Ibiza, completely different. It's going on holiday, so the car's going to be stationary for at least a week. Again, very different use case, usually near an airport, something like that. The no driveway use case is this is my only option to charge, so I have to charge wherever I can. Location is quite a strong driver for this one because ideally people usually want to do that pretty close to home, you know, on the street or at a hub, maybe 5-10 minutes walk away at the worst. And finally, long commute. So this is someone that has a long commute and typically needs to top up either on the way there or on the way back. So those are the use cases. Very, very sort of user-centric. We might not have got everything, but we'd appreciate your comments on that. Right, so next slide, please. So what have we done with this? Right, so here's on to the analysis, a bit more complicated slide. The data that is available in each of these use cases varies, and the data that you need to complete that use case varies. So what we've done is analyze those data needs and offers using a Moscow analysis. And if you've not come across that, that's classifying the data items as I must have this data item, I need it, otherwise I can't do it. I should have this data item, I'd really like it, but I cope without. Could have, it's very optional data item, but if I had it, that might be nice because I might be able to use that for other things. And won't have, I definitely don't need that data item to complete this, this charging transaction. So I've done a Moscow analysis on each of those for all of the data items. And what we observed was these seem to, the data items seem to group themselves into some logical groups, which is shown in the middle there. there's a lot of data items around just finding the right charger. Where is it? Is it the right charger for me? If I need a rapid charger, is it rapid? If I need a slow charge, is it slow? Is it open? Is it working? There's a lot of data that falls into that, as you can imagine, must have and should have for just finding the right charger. And these days you can usually do that through the apps, but there's definitely some gaps there, and some things that we've noticed. I'll come on to that. Then when you come to actually using the thing, so this is getting it to switch on and switch off, this often causes issues because either there's no means to initiate the charge, I haven't got the RFID card, I can't identify myself to the charger, I can't pay, I don't know how long I can stay there for, do I have to pay for the parking? And then there's lots of other niceties down there, like is it V to G, where's the energy coming from, is it green energy or not? These are kind of the should haves and could haves that may factor into a decision but are not essential for completing that use case. The one in the middle, the amenities, was one where this is quite a gap. It turns out that for many of the use cases, the surrounding amenities around the charge point are actually super important. Is it lit? Can I get something to eat or drink? Can I go shopping? Is there something to keep the kids occupied? Are there toilets? Can I book it? Is there a step? Is it sheltered? Is it well lit? These are, while they're not absolutely essential for the charging transaction, they do feature quite highly in a lot of the use cases, and there's quite a few gaps in the existing data streams in the amenities. So that's one that we see as an opportunity, and I'll come on to that. Then we go on to the more infrastructure type things, that these are the data items that are often talked about, and the charge point often it just wants to know that you can pay. It doesn't need to know, for example, who you are, although it might try and find out. It doesn't need to know really what the car is, or even the state of charge of the battery. Usually all the charge point needs to know is what's the maximum charge rate you can take from the car, and who's paying. And if you can complete that, then usually the charge point is happy. There are some nice to haves, like how long are you going to be, how much energy do you want, because that allows some of the scheduling that Joachim talked about earlier. So there's a list there. Registration plate was an interesting one that came out, because at the moment very few charge points try to get your registration plate because they don't need it, because you've got an ID card or a means of payment. But proving your identity and being able to bill, if that could be done through the registration plate, that might be a very easy data item to collect in the future, although it's not one that we do now. So that's a potential one to consider. Anyway, some interesting data items that appear there. Finally, the energy system considerations. What does the energy system need to do its stuff? As Joachim said, we need to tell the energy system how many kilowatts we're pulling right now, but ultimately how many kilowatts might we need tomorrow, next week, the week after, how much we can vary that kilowatts. And one of the crucial ones is, where's it connected on the network? It's all well and good knowing physically where the charge point is, geographically, that's useful. But ultimately, where it's connected on the network is actually a super important identifier, and we don't have that at the moment. It's usually the MPAN, the site MPAN would be very useful. So that was a gap that we identified. So this is the analysis that we've done, and what we've done is looked at the existing open standards data sets, what's available, and analyzed whether or not these data items are available, and we'll be publishing the results of that, in the next month or so. But what I wanted to do was share with you some of our initial conclusions, and then hopefully get some feedback through the Q&A and get your thoughts on what we need to look at next. So if we could have the next slide, please, and come on to my last slide. Right. So we've done an analysis, and what's dropped out is actually there are some quite easy wins. These are data items that are nearly there, but not quite. For example, the National Charge Point Register has some good stuff, but it's just not quite right in terms of the information that users want, and maybe some tweaks there and some improvements could solve this problem. Just uniquely identifying a charge point so that the whole industry can refer to it correctly. That's missing at the moment. Our hope is that this can be achieved fairly quickly through consensus, because these are hopefully non-contentious data items. Obviously, legislation and mandatory stuff is an option, but our recommendations are going to be very much around the recommendations. There's also some nice opportunities around the charge point discovery. This is sort of the additional soft data around what amenities there are around the charge point. A lot of the apps like WhatsApp, ZapMap, and I'm trying to be neutral here and make sure everyone gets a mention, and PlugShare are starting to add this kind of metadata like a photograph or additional amenities, but that data is kind of social media. It's unmanaged and it isn't always correct. And certainly some of the more fundamental metadata around a charge point, like what's the biggest vehicle I can fit in it? These are the sorts of data items that need to be shared. What's the maximum time I can stay there before I get fined for an overstay? Can be very difficult to find out. And these are the sort of data items that really need to be available so that users can pick the right charge point. So we've identified some easy wins around location, charge point speed, connector type, and getting a unique ID. Interestingly, the operator is actually surprisingly difficult to find out. The National Charge Point Register has the designated operator, but often it's not quite right. And I noticed some of the apps try to show you with a little picture as to which charge point operator is running that charge point. It's not always clear. Whereas, say, for a petrol station, it's usually pretty clear as to whether it's an Esso or a BP or Shell or whatever. So there's some things to do there, and those we'll be definitely recommending those. There are other things that are more difficult, and I'm sure these will come as no surprise to you. Some of the more fundamental hard limits, like vehicle size. What's the penalties? Is the charge point working? What are the opening times? Is it open or not? Can I get to it with my whatever restrictions and mobility I've got? Will my vehicle fit? That data around how the size of the parking space and the length of the cable, not available, and yet absolutely fundamental. I mean, as we electrify more and more transport forms, particularly vans and trucks, those size limits are going to be important. If I'm towing a trailer, can I fit? Can I get in if I've got a caravan? These are questions that are very, very difficult to find out from the data at the moment. So there's some interesting use cases emerging, which probably aren't really addressed by the current data sets. And that brings me on to the last point I wanted to make, is that these use cases, while we've identified some here, it's clear that they are changing and evolving quite rapidly as different classes of user adopt EVs. This activity to keep charge points easy to use needs to be, in my view, a continuous effort. It's not going to go away. And an open question for the people on the call is how should the industry track and respond to these developing use cases? This exercise is a one-off. We're going to produce some recommendations, but I believe this is going to require some ongoing responsibility to keep the charge points working and usable. And I'd be very interested in your views on that. So I think that's probably taken a little bit longer than my allotted quarter of an hour, about right. But that is where we're up to. I think we've got some questions lined up. So I think as we go over to a Q&A session, and then we'll do the poll first, I think, to spur some questions, and then we'll go to the question panel. So hopefully the polls appeared now. And yeah, the first one, so I'm going to talk through these while you're considering your answer. We're particularly worried that while we focused on the sort of popular use cases, have we missed anything around legally protected characteristics? I'm thinking here of people with disabilities, people with restricted mobility, people with particular needs that need to be accounted for, because while they might not be big in number, their needs are very important, and particularly the legally protected ones, but also the ones that are just important generally. And if you've got views on that, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll pick them up. We've looked at the standards that are listed there. So National Charge Point Register is an obvious one because the API is available. OCPI or OCPP, PAS 1878, which is the emerging smart energy standard from smart energy device standard from BASE. ISO 15118, sometimes known as plug and charge, rapidly developing that standard, and SIM as a general interchange format. Those are the standards that we evaluated. Have we missed any? I don't know, but if there are other open data definitions or standards that we should be looking at, then because we do want to go down the open standards route wherever possible, rather than making it UK specific. Third question, yeah, very much an opinion question. Who should be responsible for this? Is this an industry challenge? The government? Do we need a new regulator for this stuff? What can we learn from the management of petrol station forecourts and current transport infrastructure? Who ensures that the standards are right? We learned these things many decades ago for forecourts. The pricing rules are very clear. The rules around the pump and the accuracy and the filling and the payment methods are very clear. Those have been there for so long. We're almost rediscovering those for charge points. But I'd be interested in your views on where responsibility sits for this. And final one, particularly interested in this, is building on the OZEV consultation. How does it work for you? If you've used charge points, I mean, the task here is to make charge points simple and easy to use. And the question is, are they? In your view, are they easy to use? And there's some choices there, and it'd be interesting to see what your response is. So that's it from me. I think that's I'll do my best to answer any Q&A that you've got. And yep, okay. So I guess Teo, we'll go on to the questions now.
Yes, just to make sure that the audience still has a couple of more minutes to answer the polls, please do share your views. We're closing the polls in 30 seconds.
Okay.
And we've received a couple of questions. I will go to Jim Hunt, who did ask about what standards have we reviewed as part of the work, and have we developed any gaps within those standards? So BSI standards, ISO, IEC, international standards.
So yeah, so the standards that we looked at listed in the poll there. So yeah, PAS 1878. OCPI and 15118 are the main ones. I say the gaps are very much the ones that I spoke around. These standards are quite the sort of 15118 very transactional. So it's very strong on the charging transaction, to do the payment, to do the authentication. I think we're well covered there. The real gap is the softer metadata around the charge point. So as you zoom out from the charge point and look around, that's where the data gets very weak. The accessibility, the who's running it, what are the facilities like. And yet those seem to be the ones that are quite important data items for making charge point easy to use. So I think it's the surrounding metadata. The National Charge Point Register has a go at it, but the data definitions in the National Charge Point Register are there's a lot of free text in there, and that's making it more difficult than it needs to be for the various app providers like WhatsApp and ZapMap and PlugShare to provide that service. And it also means you get slightly different answers depending on which app you look at, and that's not always a great thing. So I think there's an opportunity here to make that charge point discovery phase a lot easier. So that's probably one of the bigger gaps that would come on. And the other one I've touched on was on the energy system side, the MPAN, for example. MPANs are currently deemed to be personal data for reasons best known to those in authority, which means that it's a harder data item to discover than it needs to be, whereas actually that identification point of where does the charge point enter the electricity network, we need to know this. We need that identifier, and the MPAN exists. Clearly, the data that surrounds the MPAN, the metering data, that's absolutely commercial and private. But the actual MPAN itself is probably something we've got to recommend that should be opened up. And the last gap was mine's gone blank. No, I don't remember. Those are the gaps anyway. So that's hopefully that answers your question, Jim.
Jim has also messaged to say that in answer to your question.
Standards there. Yeah, no, thanks for those. Yeah, what we'll do is we'll bring those standards in. Certainly the transactional stuff is pretty good. It's where we're not finding standards is where the gaps are. But yeah, we'll pull those the IEC standards in as well. Thanks, Jim.
And also, just to mention that the group is also touching base with relevant experts in drafting some of those standards as well. So we will definitely get some firsthand feedback on some of our thoughts.
I'm just going to pick up on the poll results because I realize it's a snap poll, but not one person said that charge points are very easy to use. I use them regularly without problems, and I think that tells us that we've still got a bit of work to do. But yeah, not one person said that they have no problems. So, yeah, unsurprising, but yeah, interesting to see. Thank you.
Nigel did say that we should have probably included a don't know alternative to some of the questions, but that's okay. More questions. So a question from Nigel Morris. Does Google Maps give sufficiently detailed views to answer some of these data needs for consumers?
That's a great question. I mean, it kind of does in terms of the look around of the area and where there's a street view. Where it fails is the specific location of the charge point. I mean, I know Google have started to put the charge points on, which is great, but the back to the accessibility and being able to see it, to a degree, Google does help. How easy that is to access, or whether we should be dependent on Google for that is a question for the policymakers. But yeah, there's a lot in that street view that helps. But how lonely and dark is it at night? That's a common one that comes up. Google Maps doesn't answer that, and we need to find a way of is it sheltered? Not always clear. It's not always clear from the Google Maps. So I think to a degree, Nigel, but we need more. But yeah, it's a good suggestion.
Lee Griffith has asked if any of our data or findings have been published yet. We have not published, so we are currently working on our report, and this workshop will help us to identify some gaps that we perhaps have in our thinking or methodology. So Lee, just to say, we are publishing our findings towards the end of May, and afterwards I will go through what are the next steps for our working group and for EVET phase 2 as well.
I should add actually that the use cases that we've developed our aspiration, if we have time, is the energy systems catapult have got the charging point use case, or a generic one, on their website as part of the Open Energy Data Initiative. And what I'm hoping is that our breakdown of the use cases can be published through that portal. The Energy Systems Catapult have been very helpful in giving us access. So hopefully we can put our analysis in their website, and then it can be taken forward by other groups as well. So we'll try and open source as much of the analysis that we can as well, because yeah, clearly it doesn't just end with the reports. So watch out for that as well.
And Leigh has also asked, can the EV chargers themselves be enforced to report their status, error codes, charging status, chargers, etc.?
And this is where the recommendations will be a little heavier. I mean, I think for some of the things like the ID and some of the non-contentious stuff, we can achieve that through voluntary. Errors, charging status, I suspect that some either legislation or compulsion may be required. Again, it's not our position to pick up that policy. OZEV will be taking that and making recommendations to government should legislation be required. But I think that is absolutely an option. We'll see where we get with the voluntary codes, but I'm sure OZEV.
We also have a more broad public policy question from Elijah Botham. In terms of increasing consumer appetite nationally for the uptake of EVs, do you think the UK government's fiat approach of using legal measures, for example, the ban of new petrol cars by 2030, is a preferable method to allow consumer demand to grow more organically absent of such muscular forms of environmental policy?
I can only I'm going to give a personal answer on that one. I think legislation is always the last resort. It's always better if it can be customer led. I think this is clear. I think in this case, what's very interesting about the ban is, because it's not a ban on existing cars, it's a ban on sale. I think what the government have done is quite clever in that banning new things rather than use of existing things works very well. We saw this with the transition to LED lights, for example. Yes, there's always a little bit of pushback when people can't buy their favorite light bulbs anymore. But what we've seen with LEDs is we saw the prices collapse with LEDs as they became, rather than as an exotic replacement, they became the default. The prices fell tenfold, and now pretty much all lamps are LED. And that came about as a result of a ban on the sale of incandescent bulbs. I think it's very clear that people will stick with older technology for as long as they can. I'm no social scientist, but it's clear that simply waiting for people to make a choice for something new and scary and different is probably not the answer either. So I think this strong nudge, it's much stronger than a nudge, but this 2030 ban will have the effect of accelerating EV development and also bring the prices down much more quickly. And I think the good news is the volumes bring the price down. The challenge here is to get the volume up. And by forcing the volume question, I think that's going to benefit everyone. Personal view, but I think they've got it about right. But straying into opinion there, but I think it needs both.
And another question from Fabrizio Canizzo.
Okay. Oh, great techie question. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think we haven't looked at this. I think this is for a follow-on work group as to, once we've identified the data items that we need, which will be in our report, exactly how those data items are generated, whether it can be done through semantic web or legislation or standards, I'm not, I don't know. But I think obtaining this information, I think some of the newer techniques like you mentioned there we do need to look at those. Maybe that's one for the Energy Systems Catapult or some of the researchers to contribute to, because pure standards and legislation isn't enough, and drawing it from semantic web is a lovely way of doing it if it works. So we haven't looked at that, but I think that's what I'll do is I will mention that in our report for some of the trickier data items, because I think we need to use all the tools at our disposal to get this data into the end user's hands. So thanks for that, Fabrizio.
Thank you, Paul, for your answers. Thank you so much for our participants. We will now swiftly move on to our final presenter today.
Hello.
I would like to welcome Thomas Brooke Bullard, who is a policy researcher at Citizens Advice, and he will take us through our initial thinking around data access and privacy framework.
Fantastic. Cool. Thanks, Teo. So to begin with, just a quick introduction to the Citizens Advice Energy Policy team for anyone who's not aware of the work that we do in this space. We're the statutory consumer advocate for energy consumers, and we work with the government, the regulator, suppliers, and other stakeholders to advocate on behalf of energy consumers in Great Britain, and we do that through conducting research using our own evidence and conducting new research as well. So I think the first thing to sort of emphasize up front is that the strand that we're working on for recommendation 13 is at an earlier stage than 11 and 12. So we're not really at a point where we've got any defined recommendations or findings, but we're hoping that this can be a useful opportunity to share some of our approach so far, and to talk to you guys about our next steps. And we'd really welcome any questions on anything you think that we might be missing, or anything that you think we should be doing as we move to sort of the final stages of this piece of work. This slide is just a quick reminder of sort of what came out of the first phase of the EV Energy Taskforce. So as Teo said earlier, the phase proposed that Ofgem and government introduce a data and access and privacy framework for the EV sector, to ensure that consumers have full control over their data by 2021. And it also recommended that consumers should be made aware of all data access issues at the point of sale of all EV products and services, and as well as making them aware of their powers to control and delete this data. And something that I've just noticed missing from this slide, which is sort of fairly crucial, is we're also looking into whether there is a need for a new sort of the extent to which there actually is a need for a new data access and privacy framework, or where this is already covered by existing regulations, or whether this can be accomplished by enhancing existing legislation. It's worth discussing at this stage why it's important to have a data access and privacy framework in place. So I think Paul has given a really good overview of the types of data that are essential for a good public charging experience. But it's also worth saying sort of personal data about sort of how and when people are charging their EVs, and personal data beyond that will be really essential to that experience, and also to driving EV uptake. But we know that consumers have a lot of concerns over sharing their energy data, and they're much more likely to share that data if they have the control and visibility over the data that they share. Cool. So this is just a brief summary slide of the approach that we've taken so far. So we've sort of begun from the principle of developing a sort of broad and brief statement of the ideal consumer principles that we think should underpin a data access and privacy framework, and we'll go into that in the next slide. And as discussed earlier, we really don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we're also interested in finding out to what extent there actually is a need for a new data access and privacy framework, or where this is already covered by existing legislation or can be enhanced by existing legislation. To achieve this, we decided to take a sort of risk register approach. The basis was to begin by brainstorming all of the possible consumer risks that exist to achieving our ideal consumer data principles. And we've been thinking about those in the sort of short, medium and longer term as well. Next, we have been mapping out existing legislation against those risks and sort of looking for any gaps in coverage and the extent to which existing or forthcoming legislation will cover those risks. The plan is that this will feed into recommendations for a data access and privacy framework. And then the final piece of work, which we'd be really interested, and I think we've got a question on this later, for people's views on is sort of which body would be responsible for a data access and privacy framework. Is it Ofgem or do we need a new regulator? Or yeah, it's very much an open question. So as discussed, we wanted to start with a sort of ideal brief set of principles that should underpin any data access and privacy framework. And those are here. The first is that consumers have control over how much data they share and when they share that data. And there must also be an option to access charge points without the sharing of key personal data. And then the second one is that consumers should not be locked into specific arrangements with a particular provider because of a certain data sharing arrangement. So flowing from those principles, we've begun by sort of having a brainstorm and thinking about the number of consumer risks in the short, medium and longer term to achieving those principles. So it's worth just sort of going through all of these now. There's quite a lot of crossover between some of these risks, so it might make sense to merge some of them together at a later date. So the first one is the risk of consumers being locked into unfavourable arrangements. So one example for this is where data sharing arrangements via something like plug and charge could lock people out of charge points if they don't have the ability to share data and it's through another provider, which would be a terrible consumer journey and definitely something we'd want to avoid. The other is around the sort of control and visibility over the data they share. As I said earlier, that's something that's really key to giving consumers the confidence to share their data and to engage with this market. The risk is that if people don't know the level, type, or granularity of the data, then they're going to be less likely to want to engage with that. And then the next one is sort of covered less, I think, but is really important actually, which is data portability. So it's really important that people are able to access their data, but also transfer that data across and compare new deals with that data, so they're not locked into an unsuitable relationship with an existing provider. And I think this is something that's already being covered to some extent by the Smart Data Review, and that's something we've looked at to a certain extent as well. The next one is potentially out of scope, but it's sort of worth discussing, sort of consumer access to tools and data that they need to compare deals and making sure that that the right data is available to be shared across providers, and that's something that has been covered in the OZEV consultation as well. Yeah, the next one is a sort of question around what actually constitutes personal data, and that's a question over sort of confusion around, for example, is the payment mechanism linked to the car or to an individual, and what is personal data, and that's confusion, both something that we need to sort of bottom out, but also something that that people need to be aware of when they're consenting to sharing their personal data. And then the next one is hidden or non-optional data sharing, and this sort of links again to the second and fourth risks on sort of visibility of data sharing. It's really important that that although there might be sort of plug and charge solutions where people are incentivized to share greater levels of personal data, it also needs to be possible for people to have a sort of upfront availability to access a charge point without sharing data that they don't want to share, we can't end up in a situation where somebody turns up at a charge point and the only option in order to access that charge point is to share personal data, which is not relevant to that charging. And then the next one is around consumers in vulnerable circumstances. I think this cuts across all of the risks that we've identified. For example, sort of any arrangements that that disadvantage digitally excluded consumers who don't have the access to tools or skills to share data. Yeah, there's just an ongoing risk of certain groups being put at risk. And then the final one is around sort of lack of pricing visibility and not having the data immediately visible or apparent at the time of charging to compare offers. And this is something again that's covered quite extensively in the OZEV consultation. Yeah, so that's sort of the early foundational work that we've done really, which is the mapping out of the consumer risks. And the next step is to consider where the key gaps are and develop our recommendations around these. It's really worth saying that, yeah, emphasizing again that we really don't want to reinvent the wheel. So a lot of the work is to sort of look at where these risks are already covered by existing legislation and therefore where the gaps lie in protections. And then another big piece of work, which it would be great to get people's thoughts on, is which body people think should be responsible for a data accessibility and privacy framework, if at all. And sort of put that out to people as well. And I think we've got one poll question along those lines, if I'm right. Yes. Do you think that Ofgem and government should be responsible for such a framework? Yes, no, or a third party? So if people can put in their answers to that, I'd be interested to see what people have to say.
In the meantime, there is a question from Alex Gluak. Question for Tom. When you discuss provider, do you refer to an EMSP or a CPO or some other organization?
Great, thanks, Alex. I think when talking about provider, primarily talking about e-mobility service provider or a charge point operator. But I definitely think that this could extend to other parties working in this space, and I'd be interested if you have any insights on other providers that we should be looking at.
Are there any further questions with regards to our work on recommendation 13 so far? If not, we have prepared a couple more questions for the audience to respond to. If we could launch the last set of questions, that would be great. And in the meantime, if people are eager to submit any more questions, please do so in the Q&A section. I would like to invite Joachim and Paul to join us. So just giving a minute or so for people to respond. In the meantime, Elijah Balsek has a question for Tom. Generally, do you think consumer anxiety around EVs is driven, no pun intended, more by a lack of intrinsic knowledge about the EV sector than by fears around data access and privacy?
Thanks, Elijah. That's a really great question and probably not one that I have a specific answer to now. I think that probably there's a relationship between the two as well. I think that there is a certain anxiety around knowledge that is driven around knowledge in the EV sector, and I think that also extends to knowledge of data access and privacy as well. So I think having a clear piece on that would be useful. But I think I can't give a definitive answer on that, but I think they're both very important.
I think it's very important not to undermine people's trust by taking data sharing for granted, even if it isn't controversial. I think, back to the number plate recognition one. I mean, we all know that number plate recognition can make it very easy to use a car park or and access things. But that's a clear exchange. And I think if we are asking for any data, we've just got to be very open about why that data is being collected and what it's going to be used for, and give people the option of not doing it. And then it doesn't lead to this suspicion, because I don't think it's a big concern now, but I think if we were to not approach this in a very open way, you very quickly get pushback. We saw this with smart meters. So so I'm keen to be very, very full on the on data privacy.
So let's just have a look at the polls. Interesting, none of the above answer. Which recommendation do you think is most crucial? So first, with respect to the data access and privacy. Okay, we do have some more questions. How has Japan tackled some of these questions? They already have systems in place to build community resilience of the grid from EVs as they suffered earthquakes, etc. I am not sure. I have personally the answer, but it might be something that we can explore further in our work. Or if you have any case studies, please do share them. There will be an opportunity to share more feedback after this session. Sophie Naylor, on user data permissions and control, do you have thoughts on avoiding overwhelming users with unclear permissions requests, as we see with GDPR compliance on websites, etc.?
Thanks, Sophie. I think that's a really good point, and something that we need to consider. I think that's probably out of scope for what we're doing here, but something that we should consider going forward. I think there isn't value to, we know from our own personal experience and also from the research, that giving people a long list of permission requests in legalese is not a great way for people to actually have full understanding and confidence in the data that they're sharing. I think one option that we have sort of looked into at Citizens Advice is a form of sort of data dashboard, and that means that you're not constantly being confronted with permission requests every time you access something, but it's a sort of centralized space where people can go in and check on the data that they are sharing and their permission requests, and edit them as and when their circumstances change. So I think there's lots of things that we can consider, but I agree with you that avoiding that is really, really important.
A lot of user-related data might be useful if aggregated and anonymized at adequate level. Would the need for personal identifiable information? Have you analyzed the data usage scenarios around individual charging behaviors?
Is that one for me, or is that one? I guess either I or Paul can take that one. Happy to.
Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's at the moment, it's very difficult to anonymize, this sort of data. Even if you do anonymize it, it's very easy to piece it back together and make it personally identifiable. Cars and location by definition are, very easy to de-anonymize. So it's one of those things where you can try and aggregate, but actually when you're looking at particular use cases and how people particularly want to do something that's personal to them, I think my suspicion is going the anonymization route is fraught with difficulties, and you end up with the problem that we ended up with the smart metering, where because of the anonymization that is necessary to prevent the network operator from identifying your data, the result is the energy system gets anonymized aggregated data, which to to be blunt, is useless, and we can't do anything with it. So it's sort of, I think it would have been better to have asked upfront to say, we'd like access to this data. This is why. It's up to you whether you give us that permission or not. And then if you do get the permission, then we've got the data we need, because there's a risk you end up collecting a load of data and then you can't actually do anything with it. So my personal approach is ask for it and allow people the option of not giving it. Would be my thought on that one.
Yes, absolutely. And also, I think we see anonymized data, especially in the energy sector, where for certain services, it is quite difficult to analyze and map where the issue lies exactly because it is anonymized. So difficult to rectify with anonymization.
I would suggest that from a cloud service point of view, a lot of data can be provided in an anonymous way, which is very, very useful because it's specific. I mean, we know it in terms of the infrastructure, et cetera, and so forth. It doesn't require personal data as such. I think there's already a low-hanging fruit that we can definitely benefit from it. I think if you turn it the other way around, if you want the consumer to benefit from it, and essentially then certain service offerings are specific to certain preferences of the consumer, then it kind of is unavoidable that the data is no longer anonymous because it's essentially customized for that particular recipient. So I think there's different aspects to it. So certain things that we can move in an anonymous way, but if you want to generate benefit for certain consumers, then I think, to be honest, if there is value for the consumers would not have much issues to, sign up for it.
We have a question from Sean Guppy, addressed to Tom. Has the ad hoc access requirement for public charge points in the alternative fuels infrastructure regulation factored into your thinking about providing personal data to CPs? Do you feel it's currently fit for purpose?
Thanks, Sean. The short answer to that is no, not yet. And thank you for flagging that. And that's certainly something that we would be interested to look into. And also, if you've got any thoughts on that, it would be great if you get in contact with me and we can discuss that.
We have a question from Elijah Bassa for all of the panelists. In places like Norway and the Netherlands, where EV uptake has been substantially higher than other countries, do you have any analysis on their approach to privacy and data access? Maybe I can just answer initially. So indirectly, yes, I would say, because some of our thinking has been derived from the Energy Data Taskforce findings, which has considered Norway and Estonia in some of their use case studies. And I know that there has been some work done before in publication of that work as well. So I suppose indirectly, yes, but directly, no.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, Norway is unusual because public charging is, despite the very high uptake of EVs, public charging is still relatively uncommon in Norway, a lot less than you'd expect. Netherlands, on the other hand, there's a lot of public charging because there's fewer driveways. And I think we need to look at how it's being dealt with across Europe. I mean, clearly, plug and charge looks like the way forward, but exactly what frameworks there are to govern the private data that's exchanged in that, I'm not aware. So that's what we should look at other countries as well, definitely. And as Teo says, other parts of EVET have been looking at that. We haven't.
I think my personal experience from the Nordics, I would call it, is I think culturally they are more advanced in terms of using data and making use of data. And I think there is certainly something to be learned from there, for sure.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid the cultural, but yes, I agree. Yes, it's less of an issue, it would appear. But no, we shouldn't take it for granted. No, of course.
Of course, I would like to welcome any use cases or case studies that you may have, that you think we should be looking at. Please do send them to us. We're happy to review. Proceeding to next steps then. So in terms of next steps, we would like to welcome your feedback by end of next week, 14th of May. We will share with you the slides, the questions from the polls, and the recording as well. So please do share any information with us that perhaps you did not think of today, or any questions that you may have, or any thoughts at all. So our final report on data accessibility and privacy will be submitted to the EVET steering group at the end of the month. My understanding is that all of the different working groups are submitting their reports by the same date, and they will be edited and later on, I suppose, published towards summer. But if you have any questions or anything that you would like to find out in advance of summer, please get in touch as well. So once the groups have submitted the reports, yes, the findings will be published later on, and we believe that phase 3 of the electric vehicle energy task force will launch in June as well. I also wanted just to say a huge thank you to our group. So we only have had a fraction of our members of the group today, but the participants in our group that I would like to thank for all of the work are the Energy Networks Association, Gemserv, Citizens Advice, EA Technology, Osprey Charging, Baringa, the Energy Systems Catapult, our colleagues from BASE, Ofgem, OZEV, and Electrolink and SMMT. So thank you so much for the hard work. And for any feedback, please contact me directly. We will share all of this information with you after this event, and you can find the findings from the other workshops on the EVET website as well. So I think if there are no more questions for us today, we will give you back some time to your Thursday afternoon. And thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much to our speakers. And we will be in touch shortly. Thank you.